Good evening. Thank you for joining us. This is a lecture sponsored by the Summer Cultural and Recreational Events funded by the government of the student body. We're very pleased tonight to have with us Mr. Leslie Galb, the National Security Correspondent for the New York Times, to speak to us on nuclear war and nuclear peace. Mr. Galb is particularly qualified to address such a subject by his academic background, by his governmental service background, and also by his service in some non-governmental organizations that have dealt with this question of arms control and nuclear weapons. Mr. Galb has held various positions within the government dating back to the mid-1960s when he served in the Office of the International Security Affairs of the Department of Defense and dealt with the questions of policy planning and arms control. In fact, he indicated to me earlier that SALT I discussions were just beginning during his last year at ISA. More recently, he has served in the Carter administration from 1977 to 1979 as Director of Political Military Affairs within the Department of State, again with a principal responsibility for dealing with questions of arms control policy. Aside from this governmental service and some additional work upon Capitol Hill with Senator Javits earlier, he has also participated in arms control activities associated with the Brookings Institute and with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. In addition to these kinds of governmental services and non-governmental services, he has also written widely outside of his newspaper responsibilities in terms of various journals, but also has had a very significant book published called The Irony of Vietnam, The System Worked, in which the book that won the American Political Science Association's Woodrow Wilson Prize for the best book in international politics in 1981. So Mr. Galb really does have a very sound background to address the question of nuclear war and nuclear peace. Mr. Galb.
I'm always very embarrassed being introduced because I've had 9 jobs in 20 years, and my mother thinks I'm a bum. I also managed to come in government at each opportune moment for a disaster. My first day being associated with the Vietnam War, and the second with the SALT II treaty that never got ratified. Subject that we're going to talk about tonight is one that I care an awful lot about. Nuclear war and nuclear peace. And I care a lot about it, not only because our survival really is at stake. These weapons, although they haven't been used, we can't assume, be confident that they won't be used in the future. It means a lot to me, obviously, for that, but just as much by virtue of the fact that this is an area where, almost more so than any other foreign policy area, you have a high baloney factor. Foreign policy, in and of itself, is filled with baloney. Our government gets away with it in good part because people don't know much about it, and they think it's beyond them. It's too complicated. It deals with parts of the world that we can't be expected to really know a great deal about. So people kind of shrug and give up and go along. And the baloney factor is not monopolized by either the right or the left in our foreign policy debate. It's both. It really is both. And what I'm going to ask you to do at the start of my talk is stay with me on 2 assumptions. One, that you really can understand this subject, that nuclear issues are in fact less complicated than trying to understand a tax bill or a piece of welfare legislation, that it is well within your comprehensibility. And secondly, stay with me on the assumption that both left and right in this debate about nuclear affairs may have led you astray. So set aside what you've come in with and just believe those two things for the next 50 minutes. I approach this subject in the spirit of the great American philosopher Woody Allen, who said, "We are at a crossroads. Down one path lies total destruction. Down the other, complete annihilation and holocaust. Let us pray that we can choose wisely." Why is it that it took 4 years from the time really I left the government in 1969 until 1972 before we got the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I? It was a treaty, a treaty and an executive agreement to be precise. It was an ABM treaty, an anti-ballistic missile treaty, that said each side could keep the anti-ballistic missile sites it had developed up to that point, but no further. It was an executive agreement that said each side could have as many missiles as they had deployed up to that point, but no more. But they could do anything else. Why was it that it took so long to allow each side to do what they were already doing? Why did it take 4 years? Why did it take another 4 years before Gerald Ford was on the verge of signing a SALT II treaty that would have reduced these numbers very marginally, nothing more? And why did he pull back from signing that agreement, since it did nothing more than that? What was the harm in it? What was the problem? And why was it when I re-entered the governmental picture in 1977 with Jimmy Carter that we didn't pick up where President Ford had left off with the outlines of an agreement that was called the Vladivostok Agreement, in honor of his meeting with Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, in the city of Vladivostok? Why don't we just pick up with that, sign it, go on to the next stage of agreement? Why was it that instead President Carter decided he wanted a comprehensive agreement to go well beyond the Vladivostok terms? And it took us another 2 years, 2.5 years to be precise, before we signed that agreement. And why is it that it's been 4 years since then, 4 years since we signed the SALT II treaty that we didn't ratify, that we've been negotiating and haven't got anything at all? They've been in Geneva now for 4 years and literally have not progressed on one major issue. Why is that? Why is it that we've had now arms control for almost 2 decades and have done so little? Why is it that President Reagan is observing the SALT II treaty when he called it practically treasonous, said he wouldn't submit it for Senate ratification because it was so bad? If it were so bad, why is he observing it? And why is it, if he believes, as he has said, that the Soviet Union has strategic nuclear superiority over the United States, that he's negotiating with them at all? Because he has said over and again that the United States must not, cannot afford to negotiate from a position of weakness. And if we're not in a position of weakness, why is it taking us so long to strike a bargain. And if we are in a position of weakness, if we are as inferior as our president tells us, why would the Soviet Union make the kind of concessions he's calling upon them to make? Where's the sense in it all? What's really going on? Nuclear politics really is a beast unto itself that you have to begin to understand in its own terms. It's special, it's different. In Milton's Paradise Lost, toward the end of Book 6, the angel Raphael takes Adam aside, and he explains to him the war among the angels. And he tells Adam that when Satan and his followers began their rebellion, a war started between the loyal angels and Satan's followers. And in the first day of fighting, the loyal angels seemed to be prevailing. And that night, Satan gathered all his followers, and they were discussing why they were losing. And they agreed very quickly that it wasn't a question of intelligence or ingenuity. It must be that the loyal angels had better weapons. And Nisroch, Satan's lieutenant, suggests what we need is a better weapon. And Satan says, that's exactly what I was thinking. And in fact, I've invented one, a field gun. And we'll put it together tonight. We'll manufacture many of these, and we'll turn the tide of battle tomorrow. And they did. When the battle started, Satan's forces began to push the loyal angels back. And the loyal angels, in their frustration, resorted to the ultimate weapon. They began pulling up the hills of heavens by their very roots. And they started to win. And Satan's followers, of course, responded in kind, pulling up the other hills of heavens and hurling them at the loyal angels, in a battle that Raphael described to Adam as one which he said it was an uproar that made a civil war look mild. And he also told Adam that the kinds of weapons being used there, these ultimate weapons, would be reinvented by your progeny if malice abounds. At some point in this battle, God sends his son to intervene, stop the fighting, and Satan and his followers are cast out into darkness. And the angels would have survived anyway, even if heaven had been destroyed. But we wouldn't. We can't count on that divine intervention, and we would not survive the ultimate weapon. So how have we come to deal with it? Because this weapon truly is special. In August 1945, we dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. That bomb killed instantly upwards of 100,000 people. It was a bomb of roughly 12 kilotons, or 12,000 tons of TNT. That is now the size of the smallest nuclear weapon we possess. Let me give you an idea of the kind of power we have now harnessed for purposes of military use. Take one Poseidon submarine, one U.S. Poseidon submarine. Sails out from a port in Groton, Connecticut. And it's being tailed by some of our own ships just to see if we can follow it. The submarine at some point dives, and after 24 hours, it's lost the chasers. And it's sitting out there somewhere in the North Atlantic. And this one submarine has 16 missiles. And on each missile is 10 warheads, 160 different warheads. There are about 200 cities in the Soviet Union with a population of 200,000 or above. Each one of these warheads is about 40 kilotons, or more than 3 times the destructive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So one Poseidon submarine can destroy 160 cities in the Soviet Union with 3 times the force of the bomb we dropped on Hiroshima. We have about 10,000 such strategic warheads. We have another close to 7,000 tactical nuclear warheads deployed in Europe, battlefield weapons. We have another 6,000 such weapons deployed in the Asian theater, and roughly 5,000 to 6,000 of these tactical weapons, nuclear weapons, stored here in the United States. So today, the United States has something like 25,000 nuclear warheads and bombs. Virtually all of them more powerful than the one we dropped on Hiroshima. This is the kind of awesomeness that by itself ought to make us want to know what's really going on, to find out the answers to those questions that I asked. As we try to come to grips with this nuclear reality, kind of 3 images began to dominate the public debate as we tried to understand this power, come to grips with it. One was the image of Armageddon, that we now have the power to destroy ourselves. And this kind of mentality, the image of Armageddon, led to 2 conflicting feelings. To some, it led to a very devout idealism, that we've got to rid ourselves of this capability. We can't trust ourselves with it. It's too horrible. Let's have real disarmament. And others who had this Armageddon image in their head became almost totally despairing. There was no hope and nothing to do. And in many ways, this mentality, I think, characterizes the political left in the United States. A combination of idealism and despair. A second image, second way of trying to grope with the nuclear reality was Hiroshima itself. And again, it was it had a Janus face and a Janus-like kind of effect. Because to some, Hiroshima was the forerunner of the ultimate horror of Armageddon. But to others, curiously enough, it was a demonstration that somehow one could endure a nuclear war, that it could be fought and that we could survive. They said, yes, Hiroshima was horrible. 85,000 dead right away, hundreds of thousands maimed forever thereafter. But look at Hiroshima today. It's a thriving, surviving city. Nuclear war is not really so unthinkable. Both looking at that Hiroshima experience. You have many people today involved with nuclear weapons policy who believe that you can fight and win and survive nuclear war, that it can be controlled. And reinforcing this is the third conception of reality, the third way of coming to terms with nuclear weapons that arose out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, President Kennedy found that the Russians had secreted medium-range missiles in Cuba. Without recounting the whole story, the essence was he told the Soviets that either they would have to take those missiles out of Cuba, or we would take some unspecified action somewhere to get them out. In other words, he seemed to be threatening nuclear war. And in fact, later, his biographers noted that he thought that the chances of nuclear war, after his public declaration, the Soviets either had to take them out, face the consequences, that Kennedy thought the chances of nuclear war were something like 1 in 3. Well, the Russians did take the missiles out, and this led to the notion that one could engage in crisis management with nuclear weapons, that you could use them as an instrument of diplomacy, that we had gained a major diplomatic triumph in this, that there was some real value to nuclear superiority. We had it, the Soviets didn't. It came to a crisis. We told them to get out, and they were forced to do it. Nuclear superiority had real power effects. And we've come to the point now where the combination of Hiroshima survival and crisis diplomacy a la the Cuban Missile situation in October '62 is pitted on the one side against a whole other group despairing and believing you can get rid of these weapons on the other. And these people have truly dominated the debate from these two groups. Now, it isn't a partisan question. The distortion of the debate that we're talking about tonight over nuclear weapons is not the sole province of the Democrats or the sole province of the Republicans. In 1956, the very good liberal Democratic candidate for President of the United States, Adlai Stevenson, made a major issue of what he called the bomber gap. He said President Eisenhower had allowed the Soviet Union to get way ahead of us in the development of long-range atomic bombers. Well, in fact, there was a bomber gap, as it later became quite evident, in our favor. By the thousands. We had thousands more atomic bombs to be delivered by long-flying aircraft than the Soviets did. Stevenson tried to make that an issue. In 1960, you may be better familiar with Kennedy's raising the issue of the missile gap. He said Eisenhower had allowed the Soviets to get way ahead of us in the development of intercontinental missiles. Sputnik went up in 1957. It looked like in the age of rocketry, we were being left behind. That the Soviets had over 2,000 of these ICBMs, and we were just beginning to build them ourselves. And Kennedy discovered when he was elected, if he did not know so beforehand, and I believe he did know the truth beforehand, he discovered after he was elected that there was a missile gap, that we had about 2,000, and the Russians had at most 50, or 54, I think the number. Astonishing that this could happen. And it was a very effective campaign weapon, too. Similarly, Ronald Reagan used this against President Ford in the 1976 elections, and then against President Carter in whenever the next election was, 1980. In 1976, as I mentioned before, President Ford was on the verge of concluding an agreement with the Soviets based on his Vladivostok meeting with Leonid Brezhnev. And depending upon who you believe, they were within 5 or 10% of the agreement. And they had several meetings in the White House, President Ford, Henry Kissinger, Donald Rumsfeld, who was defense secretary at that time, Ford's political advisors. They say, all right, do we make the necessary compromises now to close out this agreement? Or do we string it through the next, through the election and deal with it in the next term? And almost all of Ford's advisors urged him not to even try to conclude the treaty. That Ronald Reagan, who was running against President Ford in the Republican primaries, was making a major issue of this SALT treaty. And that this was a very effective rallying cry within the Republican Party. And they, in effect, the advisors told Ford that if you conclude this agreement, Reagan is going to take the Republican nomination away from you. Ford backed off. There was no treaty. Now, subsequently, if you take a look at his memoirs, what I'm saying is not speculation. It's all well documented and admitted to by President Ford and the people who were involved in this enterprise at that time. He wrote later that he had made a terrible mistake. He should have concluded the treaty because it was right to do so and because it would have been good politics too. But he got frightened off. In 1977, Reagan takes on the same issue with Jimmy Carter. Carter, Ford, Nixon, according to Reagan, had allowed the United States forces to fall into disrepair. Meanwhile, the Soviets were steadily climbing in their capability and had reached a position of superiority. And the polls that were taken during the 1980 election showed that most people believed this. Most Americans thought the United States had now become inferior militarily. Well, it was a Republican issue and a Democratic issue. You have people saying these things even today who are Democrats as well as Republicans. Let's examine the truth of it. Let's look at each of these major charges that have been made and see what the facts are, and see how far the facts can take us in answering the major charges. There are three. First, that the arms control agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union somehow lulled the American people into a false sense of security. That détente and arms control caused us to lower our guard, to spend less on the military than we needed to spend. Charge one. Charge two, that the Soviets cheat on the arms control agreements. Charge three, that the United States is in a position of strategic nuclear inferiority. Now, what I'm going to tell you in respect of these three questions is the facts. Where the facts are in doubt, I'll tell you that. Where the judgments are different, I'll tell you that too. But this is not a question of my opinion against somebody else's opinion. The first one, that the American people were lulled into a false sense of security by virtue of improving relations with the Soviet Union, and specifically by virtue of these arms control treaties. That somehow the American people thought that because we had signed SALT I, that peace had broken out, and we no longer needed to make the defense effort that we had in previous decades. The facts simply don't support that proposition at all. Here's what the facts are. In 1970, there began in our country a strong movement to cut military spending. That's a fact. And the movement had its origins in two things: the Vietnam War and the quest for domestic priorities. They were related. Coming out of the Vietnam War, there was a feeling that we had devoted far too much of our resources to the war and too little to domestic problems that were bubbling up. and that we had to take from the defense pot and give to the domestic pot. And mind you, this was not simply a Democratic issue. In 1970, Defense Secretary Melvin Laird, Nixon's defense secretary, sent his budget to Congress, and in his budget presentation said exactly what I told you, that he is proposing, the Nixon administration, cuts in defense spending because as we trail out of the Vietnam War, there's less need for it, and two, there's more need for spending on domestic matters. It's right there in black and white for anybody to look at. This was a general sentiment. If you go back and look at the debates in Congress, which horror I put myself through in order to see what the truth was in this matter, to read through all those congressional debates, it's a nightmare. I'd rather read a classic comic book. There are only a handful of instances over the course of a whole decade where congressmen justified their votes to cut defense spending on the grounds that they thought that the Soviet Union had now become a Pacific power and that we could afford to do it. Defense spending over that decade was, and this is a fact, as Reagan says, defense spending was a smaller part of our gross national product and a smaller part of our federal budget than it had been in the 50s and 60s. As a percentage of GNP, it was less. But in absolute terms, it remained pretty much the same. And beginning in 1976, it started to go up a little. And it would have gone up even more, but just think about what was going on at the time. We had enormous inflation, particularly in defense costs, because of the increase in oil, price of oil. Price of oil quadrupled, and this directly affected a good deal of the planned increases on military spending. In other words, they were spending more money just to buy a lot of the same amount. I think the record is very clear that the American people are not so stupid as to believe that because the Soviet Union and the United States signed some arms control treaties and started cultural and scientific exchanges, that peace had broken out between our two countries. Even though Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger were telling them that we had entered a new era of negotiation, not confrontation. It was a structure, a new structure of peace. They didn't believe it. They had enough sense to realize that we have an ingrained competition with the Soviets, that arms control might be moderating that to some degree, but it hadn't made it evaporate. So, charge one, it just doesn't stand up. Charge two, Soviets cheat. This is a tough question to deal with because the Soviets are tough to deal with. In June '79, I went off with President Carter to the summit meeting with Brezhnev and the signing of the SALT II treaty. A little sidelight on that. The evening before the talk started, we go to the Opera House in Vienna. And when President Carter comes into the royal box, there are applause from the people downstairs. Brezhnev comes in. Sadly, there were more applause for him than for Jimmy Carter. And then, as we're all looking at Brezhnev and Carter, the applause from downstairs starts to well up, just filling the whole house. And we assume that the Austrians are now cheering the two world leaders, and we're looking at the leaders very proudly. And then as the applause go on, it becomes very clear they aren't cheering these guys at all, that the conductor had mounted the podium. He was an elderly man of great repute in Austria by the name of Karl Böhm, and this was to be his farewell concert. And it turned out that was far more important to the Austrians than Jimmy Carter and Leonid Brezhnev. And when they met, the two of them, the next day, an incident occurred that shows you how difficult it is to deal with the Russians and how one has to keep that fact in mind in making arms control agreements. When two leaders meet at the summit, everything is worked out well in advance by aides. It's staged. There are actually scripts written. And we worked for 6 weeks prior to the summit with Ambassador Dobrynin and the other Soviets in the embassy in Washington on exactly what issues would be discussed, what our guy would say, what his guy would respond, and how the remaining issues on SALT would be resolved. Because when you have the two heads of state present, that's the final word. You don't want to make a mistake. And the scripting allows for precision. Also, when you have heads of state meeting or foreign ministers meeting, they're the only ones at the table who can talk. Presidents meet, only they talk. If it's a meeting of foreign ministers, only they talk. It's a very carefully choreographed event. Well, one of the issues that hadn't been fully and finally resolved with respect to the SALT II treaty concerned a Soviet aircraft that we call the Backfire. There were some Americans who thought it was a long-range aircraft and should have been counted in the SALT totals, SALT limitations, and others who felt it was a medium aircraft, didn't belong in this agreement. Soviets, of course, insisted that it had nothing to do with long-range capabilities. And the way we compromised was to agree that the Soviets would produce no more than 35 Backfires a year, and that they would not improve or increase the range and payload of this aircraft by more than a certain minimal percentage. And our leaders were to confirm that at the table. Jimmy Carter was to say, it is my understanding that you agree to the following, and state these 2 points. And then Brezhnev was to say, yes, the Soviet Union accepts those 2 conditions. And we understand you will state those conditions to Congress in presenting the treaty to the Senate. So Carter says his piece, and Brezhnev says, I understand. He was supposed to say, I understand and I accept these terms and understand you'll present them to the Congress. But he only said, I understand, which in terms of legal obligation is quite different from saying, I agree and accept. Carter let it pass. And when we all met later on, everyone jumped on him, said, you can't do this, it's a major issue. We could lose the treaty over it, you've got to go back. And raised it the next morning, even though it was not on the agenda, it had been passed, and it was all over with. So go back in the next morning, Carter raises it, Brezhnev says, what are you talking about? I told you I understand, I said it's no problem. And Carter said, but you were supposed to say, I accept and agree. He said, I said it was no problem. At which point Gromyko starts to talk, absolutely unheard of. Enters in, you're trying to make this summit fail? You're raising this extraneous issue? What are you trying to do? Make fools of us? And Vance started to talk. Again, this is chaos for one of these carefully scripted events. And then finally, Brezhnev said, all right, if it's so important to you, I accept it and I agree with it. But the fact is, he knew exactly what he was supposed to say, and he tried to do something different. And dealing with the Soviets is much that way. I find them very much akin to labor union leaders or mafiosi. And when you think about it, this is how they come to get power in the Soviet Union. That's a very rough and tumble atmosphere. And one has to be a very hard-headed bargainer to survive that process. It's not a question of going out and having a lot of rubber chicken dinners with the folks. A hell of a lot is at stake by the time you've risen to that level there.
Including a company president.
Excuse me?
Company president?
Maybe in their case, although I think style is quite different. and the style of these people is different. They are rough and tumble. They do like to engage in this bargaining process. Where we have had precise agreements with the Soviets, they have always complied with those agreements. And no one who's looked at that record will say otherwise. Where there is ambiguity, they have interpreted it to suit them, and we have complained about it. And in most cases, each of us has gone by our own interpretation and not resolved it. But where we could show that we had cause for the complaint, they often complied with that. And where we couldn't show good cause, they went about their own business. That's why, when we negotiate these treaties with the Soviets, we have documents appended to them that explain the words of the treaty. If you look at the SALT II treaty, you'll see that the appendix is 10 times the length of the treaty. And the appendix consists of a whole series of what are called agreed statements and common understandings, where because of our past experience with them, we try to nail down every possible ambiguity. You can never do it all. But where we have nailed it down, their record of compliance is very, very good. Now, what's the proof of that? The proof of that is, again, let's take Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan came into office saying the Soviets had massively violated past agreements. He has yet to formally charge the Soviets with a single violation. And I submit to you that someone who felt so strongly about their cheating would have been eager to go bring it to the appropriate channels and would have made the formal charges. He did not. He has not. Third point. We're inferior. Ronald Reagan says that. Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger says that. But the previous chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, David Jones, says, no, we're probably superior. And the present chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Vesey, says, when asked, would you trade your forces for the Soviet forces? He says, not in your life. What are the facts? The facts are that the Soviets are better than us in ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the land-based missiles. Theirs have more destructive power than ours and almost equal accuracy. And theirs are better at destroying hardened targets, targets hardened by steel and concrete, like other missiles, silos, command and control bunkers and the like. They're better.
And there's never been a case in history where air defenses have shot down
That many attacking aircraft. Nowhere near it. But even if it shot down 25%, that would still leave 75% to get through. So air defense is very limited in success against aircraft under any circumstances. In a nuclear war, it means practically nothing. So if and only if you think that land-based missiles are more important than everything else, could you believe that the Soviets have nuclear superiority? The fact of the matter is that the time will come when land-based missiles will be vulnerable to attack. And when that time comes, the Soviets will be in far greater jeopardy than we, because they have 70% of their total strategic nuclear capability in land-based missiles sitting there, one day to be vulnerable. We have only 20%. Our capability is across the board. Theirs is almost totally concentrated in that one area.